Hare Om Namaha. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, we find the following excerpt from a purport to Adi Lila, Chapter 1, Text 35. Quote, "One should always remember that a person who is reluctant to accept a spiritual master is sure to be baffled in his endeavor to go back to Godhead. One who is not properly initiated may present himself as a great devotee, but in fact he is sure to encounter many stumbling blocks on his path of progress towards spiritual realization, with the result that he must continue his term of material existence without relief. Such a helpless person is compared to a ship without a rudder, for such a ship can never reach its destination." Unquote. The arrogance of power and contempt displayed by the air quotes ISKCON gurus, many of whom were or are either psychopaths or sociopaths, is rooted in the mega narcissism of self-apotheosis. Their former disciples paid and still pay the price for that. Sometimes a mirror is mistaken for a window. There is a kind of magic present when somebody falls for that illusion. So-called ISKCON advertises its cult as a window into the spiritual world, but it is nothing more than a magic mirror, one which reflects a perverted image of who it wants you to be. Its power is institutional, and there is plenty of deception in it. Its initiations are all illusory, as every one of its initiated acolytes is converted into a helpless person without a rudder to guide the spiritual ship because he or she is not properly initiated. A bogus guru cannot give a bona fide initiation, but the magic of so-called ISKCON is that it convinces its followers that its rubber-stamped, no objection certified gurus can still pull the initiation off. If you want to overcome that, air quotes, ISKCON wonderwall, you must be determined to overcome its magic. This includes overcoming any attraction to so-called ISKCON and to its splinter groups. Besides the institutional card, it also appears to use mystic power. That's another illusion. In point of fact, neither so-called ISKCON nor any of its gurus has any significant mystic power whatsoever. It is all a magic show. It does not traffic in what it does not have. It instead traffics in illusion from every angle of vision possible. This means that along with its institutional oppression, so-called ISKCON traffics in its own garden variety magic. In March of 1978, the rank and file of the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness was still reeling from spiritual grief caused by the physical disappearance of its founder, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. His movement had an international mission. However, due to the fateful combination of the bad luck of his premature disappearance and the wrong kind of power actuated by its leaders, the Hare Krishna world would soon be rocked. That contamination was the pathological weed of today's fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. The killer blow, which would and will take decades to murder the movement, was first struck when the vitiated GBC, a theocratic oligarchy, anointed 11 of its own to create an unauthorized radical situation. We all remember what that intrusion was, the pretender Mahabhagavats of the zonal Acharya concoction. It was an infatuation. It was unsound. It was a bright, shining lie, a projected image based upon imagination. It shattered and scattered the Vaishnava system Prabhupada founded, in no small part because it was full of demoniac qualities, the opposite of what was expected of advanced Sattvic Brahmins, what to speak of gurus. Although all of the zonals were initiated as Brahmins, the history of their actions proves that none of those pretenders were Brahmins, nor were they Kshatriyas. Instead, they were effete Western warriors, former hippies and social workers, overcome by the arrogance of their power. Brahmins, real Brahmins, are adored for their honesty. Those 11 imitators and their sycophants were all dishonest men. Arrogance and contempt are demoniac qualities, and all 11 of them were afflicted by these, some more than others. Their exaggerated sense of power, supplemented by the governing body imprimatur, is proving to have, in due course of time, a fatal impact on Prabhupada's former movement. The subtle, yet devastating effect of the heady zonal Acharya era continues to this day. Over time, that disruption destroyed the confidence and self-reliance of the real workers of the Hare Krishna movement. This point about its former followers has not been recognized by many devotees, and it certainly has not been admitted by any of today's, air quotes, ISKCON leaders. It was beyond the foresight of the great pretenders' abnormal psychology to consider their personal and institutional force serving to degrade the rank and file in order to allegedly prove the superiority of their claim, their false claim. Their incessant desire for popularity and worship confused temporary power as being virtuous. Who could resist them? And why would anyone want to do so? Consider this applicable quote from Aldous Huxley. Quote, "Why are people so stupid and wicked? Why can't they see how good and intelligent we are? Why do they resist our efforts to bring them under our control and make them like ourselves?" Unquote. The unauthorized zonal Acharya scheme was an abstraction, and it was not sanctioned by the movement's founder. Instead, it was an intervention rationalized as good by its allegedly fulfilling a so-called burden of responsibility. Instead of producing gurus, which it could never do, it produced dependency and self-denigration on all the, air quotes, ISKCON inmates under its jackboot. Is there anything more arrogant than pretending to be a fully God-realized spiritual master? Perspective was lost, overcome by a devolving pseudo-Krishna movement set into motion by that zonal hoax of 1978. When it cratered, that set the stage for a compromise settlement represented by the Second Transformation. This was brought in by another set of dishonest men who had successfully worked their way to the top of the turtle tank. Yet the real question is, can a bogus guru still transmit a genuine initiation? The question practically answers itself, but there are many rationalizations connected to it. These are symptomatic of so-called religion. They are symptomatic of religion situated in the lower modes of nature. Such so-called religion is actually irreligion, and it dominates the landscape everywhere at this time. Since the major deviation of 1978 opened Pandora's box to every rationalization possible in connection to guru initiation and disciple, it should not be at all surprising that there are a plethora of groups rationalizing how, in effect, their bogus gurus can still give bona fide initiations. All such disciples, all such unfortunates who receive those kinds of fire sacrifices are improperly initiated. They should be recognized for what they are, not for what they pretend to be. Their gaslighting and the gurus and groups they associate with in forming and pushing all of that subterfuge needs to be exposed. Now, splinter groups have spun off from so-called ISKCON. For clarification, so-called ISKCON is itself a splinter group, one which spun off Prabhupada's actual branch of the Chaitanya line. It was a competitor thread even while he was physically manifest. After his departure in November of 1977, the deviation of the Pretender Mahabhagavat zonals in early 1978 created that first splinter group, which was so-called ISKCON. All of the later ones spun off from that magic show. So let's first segue to the later splinter groups. We shall then consider so-called ISKCON and its rationalizations a bit later in this presentation. To begin with, let's flesh out Neomat. This entity can only be considered a splinter group because its leaders and gurus were, many years ago, Prabhupada's initiated disciples. Otherwise, it has no link to him whatsoever. It is instead strongly connected to Gaudiya Mat in its preaching and personal presentation, in its style, in its belief system, and in its mood. Despite the fact that it does not at all feature Prabhupada, it does use him whenever that becomes helpful in the matter of bringing a newcomer into its fold. The more powerful wing of Neomat predominantly features Swami B.R. Sridhar, a former Gaudiya Mat leader. The less prominent wing features Swami Narayan, who was a disciple of one of Prabhupada's godbrothers, the godbrother who favored his divine grace and gave him sannyas. Both Swami B.R. Sridhar and Swami Narayan are no longer living. There is no need to go in depth into Neomat being divided into these two wings because their rationalizations are identical up to a point. In particular, they disparage one of Prabhupada's chief teachings, that the conditioned souls all originally came from the spiritual world of form and activity. Neomat, on the contrary, preaches that we have never been there. Since Gaudiya Mat has that same Apasiddhanta, Neomat has copied, adopted, adapted, and pushed it. Neomat's rationalizations for doing so are too voluminous to rehash here, but many of our written presentations and even some of our videos have exposed that Apasiddhanta to a significant extent previously. Neomat stands on its own when it comes to initiation. However, it is in your interest to find out what Prabhupada had to say about Gaudiya Mat, since Neomat didn't exist at the time he was manifest. In a purport to Adi Leela, chapter 12, text 8, we find this long entry. Quote, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, at the time of his departure, requested all of his disciples to form a governing body and conduct missionary activities cooperatively. He did not instruct a particular man to become the next Acharya, but just after his passing away, his leading secretaries made plans without authority to occupy the post of Acharya and they split into two factions over who the next Acharya would be. Consequently, both factions were asara, or useless, because they had no authority, having disobeyed the order of the spiritual master. Despite the spiritual master's order to form a governing body and execute the missionary activities of the Gaudiya Math, the two unauthorized factions began litigation that is still going on after 40 years with no decision. The members of the self-appointed Acharya's party, who occupied the property of the Gaudiya Math, are satisfied, but they could make no progress in preaching. Therefore, by the result of their actions, one should know that they are asara, or useless, unquote. That Gaudiya Math is useless for making advancement in spiritual life was a pillar of Prabhupada's explicit warning to his disciples about avoiding Gaudiya Math. There is no need to get hung up on tangential and secondary elements that are in that excerpt I just read, all of which are prone to degrade into misinterpretations, and by doing so thus lose the actual thread of what is being communicated in this important excerpt from that Adi Leela purport. The actual thread is the point, and we find that its essential word is repeated twice in Sanskrit and translated twice into English: asara, or useless. Concerning condemnation of Gaudiya Math, Neo Math is fully implicated. It consists of some powerful sannyasis, with most of them initiated by Prabhupada, who push a major upasiddhanta that Prabhupada defied repeatedly in his preaching and in his writings. They also push a foreign brand of style, presentation, mood, and conception. Although technically a splinter group, and again, a splinter group of so-called ISKCON and not the original paradigm, all rationalizations concerning the legitimacy of Neo Math and its preaching points must be rejected by true devotees of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. For those originally initiated by Prabhupada and previously recognized as leaders of his movement, consider those Neo Math preachers to be traitors. Neo Math is a sub-branch of a broken branch. The broken branch is Gaudiya Math from the early 20th century, as Neo Math is strongly connected to Gaudiya Math. The initiations that are conducted by Neo Math gurus are comparable to those conducted by that older entity, Gaudiya Math, an organization which Prabhupada unequivocally labels as useless. You are thus urged to reject initiation from any and all Neo Math gurus, because that organization consists of only bogus gurus, all of whom rationalize that the living entity was never in the spiritual world of form and activity, that rationalization being a killer upasiddhanta. The next analysis of a splinter group has an overabundance of rationalizations. It also engages in a great deal of gaslighting. Through these means, it attempts to establish itself as genuine, which it most definitely is not. It is the crypto-Christian, air quotes ISKCON splinter group known as Ritvik. This entity is Prabhupada-centered, but in a wrong way. As such, it is not as dark as Neo Math, but nevertheless it is just as deviated. It totally rejects the Vaishnava traditional system of initiation by claiming, with paltry evidence, that Prabhupada established a whole new system. In effect, and most Ritviks don't even try to hide this, it makes Prabhupada out to be another version of what so-called Christianity makes Jesus Christos out to be for its many churches. Ritvik is entirely anti-Vedic and anti-Vaishnav. In Vedic and Vaishnav systems, the spiritual master must physically manifest. He must be physically manifest in order to test, approve, and then initiate a disciple into a connection with the disciplic succession. The spiritual master must be physically manifest in order to absorb the disciple's sanchita karma. He must test the prospective disciple, and then, if that prospective disciple, passes those tests, give him or her a spiritual name tailored to the nature of a formally and genuinely initiated devotee. Now, as most of you know, Prabhupada established in a very few short years, proving he was Shaktivesh avatar, by the way, he established an international movement of thousands of followers. Many, if not most of them, became initiated by him through Ritviks while he was with us. Because his movement was large, he utilized Ritviks to conduct fire sacrifices on his behalf for his new disciples, even when he was sometimes present at the ceremony and witnessing it from his Vyasasana. On those occasions, Prabhupada handed the japa beads to his new disciple, personally. This is what the Ritviks claim was to be continued after his departure in mid-November of 1977, and that is the essence of their fantastic concoction. In point of fact, it is basically the only thing that many centrifugal Ritvik groups agree upon, as there are many cults under the banner of Ritvik. Again, all of them are splinter groups from the mothership of so-called ISKCON. While Prabhupada was manifest, he tested his thousands of prospective disciples through the agency of more advanced devotees who were already initiated, those who he had installed into leadership in his movement, most notably the temple presidents and a handful of sannyasis. If enough time and enough tests had been passed, those leaders then were required to send a letter of recommendation to Prabhupada for his approval, and then if Prabhupada approved, that new disciple became initiated by him, not by the Ritviks. This system was not a deviation from the guru-disciple relationship and joined in all bona fide Vaishnava sampradayas. Also, there was at least one occasion wherein Prabhupada rejected a candidate despite the fact that this fellow had been approved by his temple president in a letter of recommendation. There was probably more than one of these, but your host speaker is only aware of that one instance. Also, I am aware of someone who had been approved by the local president, who came before Prabhupada on his Vyasasana to accept his Harinama beads during the initiation ceremony. From his seat, Prabhupada directly said to him, quote, "You do not deserve to be initiated," unquote. Although the beads at that time were given to the young man, who was a really rough guy and a former biker, Prabhupada in that statement was criticizing the president for being too lenient in this particular recommendation for initiation. Multiply that by immeasurable increments when it comes to today's so-called initiations doled out by self-proclaimed Ritvik acharyas, none of whom are authorized to do what they are doing. It is all part of what Sulochan aptly labeled, quote, "the guru business," unquote. Many faithless individuals are receiving names and beads in all of these groups, despite the fact that superficially so-called ISKCON and Ritviks are, to some limited extent, Prabhupada-centered. Tattvamasi. It does get ridiculous. A faction of Ritviks claim that Prabhupada is the only guru for the remainder of the Golden Age. One of them went so far as to state in writing that Prabhupada is the only guru for billions of years in this universe. Wowzers. These fellows are labeled as hard Ritviks. Others opine that the Ritvic system of initiation by a non-manifest guru, namely Prabhupada, is to continue until the next Mahabhagavat emerges and takes charge of Prabhupada's branch of Lord Chaitanya's movement. They are known as soft Ritviks. These rationalizations are outrageous. They are easily rejected at face value by all sane, serious, and devoted transcendentalists. Ritviks rely upon a variety of rationalizations and bad logic in order to allegedly prove their heresy, and not every one of the centrifugal cults shares all of those rationalizations. However, here is one that they all buy into. They claim that the clause, quote, "my initiated disciples," unquote, in Prabhupada's final will and testament proves the Ritvik concoction. Actually, it is barely even in the category of evidence. And if you foolishly think that it is evidence, it is exceptionally weak evidence. It is common sense that Prabhupada approved the will, which was not written by him, but by his leading secretaries, with a goal to keep all of his centers in India from being transferred either to his sons or to Gaudiya Math after he left the scene. They could make claims. As such, the clause, "my initiated disciples," makes perfect sense to be included in the will, as it would only apply for at most a decade or so. After that, any and all legal claims of inheritance would be squashed, and the need for the clause would have run its course. Obviously, Prabhupada's leading secretaries would, almost in entirety, still be alive during that decade following his departure, and they would have that clause in the will to back their legal right to control all of the properties and temples in India. Indeed, that is the way in which it worked out, as one of his sons, Prabhupada's sons, is rumored to have made a truncated play for ownership on the basis of an inheritance claim. Over and above this, a massive and unprecedented change to the tradition and authorized process of initiation in Vaishnavism, and for that matter, all Vedic lines of the Dharma Shastras, such a massive change could never be established on the basis of a single misappropriated clause in a legal document that had nothing to do with tattva, siddhanta, and or the process of guru and disciple. That this clause was made a centerpiece by Ritviks clearly indicates just how foolish they are and how heretical their presupposition actually is. Another chief argument of the Ritviks is the, quote, "no change," unquote, rationalization. Now, it was a fact that Prabhupada implored his disciples not to engage in changes. And here is one example from an excerpt from a letter to one of his governing commissioners dated November 5th, 1972. Quote, "What is this road show and yoga village? It will be another hippie edition. Gradually, the Krishna consciousness idea will evaporate. Another change, every day another change. Stop all this. Don't manufacture ideas," unquote. Quite ironically, how the Ritviks apply, quote-unquote, "no change" is quite preposterous, because they are all engaged in making a major change to the process of guru, disciple, and initiation in the Vaishnava Sampradaya. Just as importantly, the principle of no change does not entail disregarding obvious facts. It also does not involve disregarding authorized adjustments as a result of an obvious fact and obvious change in the devotional environment, such as the disappearance from physical manifestation of a founder acharya. That's called a major change. That was a major change in Krishna consciousness in mid-November 1977 in the ISKCON movement. Ask yourself these questions. Can a temple president any longer write a letter of recommendation directly to Prabhupada? Where would you send it? Where would you address such a letter? Is there any rational chance that he would receive a written and signed that you, if you sent that letter, would receive a written and signed reply from Prabhupada? As such, when the principle of no change is applied fanatically, which is what the Ritviks do, then that application is an argument that immediately should be recognized as both ridiculous and very counterproductive. All right, so we've dealt with those two splinter groups, so now this brings us to the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. No group on the face of the earth is more expert in gaslighting than so-called ISKCON. It is loaded with rationalizations in order to support its contention that it and its rubber-stamped institutional gurus did and still could and can transmit bona fide initiation to newcomers, connecting them to the Guru Parampara. Now, as most of you know, so-called ISKCON embarked upon the first transformation in the late spring of 1978. This was discussed last month, and that particular transformation of the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats, along with all those zonal concoctions, was a complete deviation. This is known and realized by most of the viewers of this video. As such, we shall not hash out all of those details here once again. That deviation imposed upon Prabhupada's remnant of the Krishna movement, it was a colossal hoax, and it could certainly not entail any genuine initiations during that approximate 9 years of its truncated run. In other words, it cratered quite quickly. Excuses were needed to explain that. As such, so-called ISKCON came up with wave after wave of rationalizations as to how those 11 Sahajiyas, along with the high-profile gurus who followed them before Uttama worship was abandoned, how all of the God-men could actually initiate newcomers with the Bhakti Lata Bij, which they didn't. Here are some of those rationalizations. The first one is that the imitation Uttama process was nothing more than an honest mistake on the part of those pretenders in the governing body which approved it. The second rationalization is that even though it was a bogus arrangement, full of forceful imposition, it was nevertheless bona fide because the GBC approved it, and Prabhupada empowered the GBC to run his movement in his absence as it saw fit. Let us now consider these two convenient excuses. First, there was nothing honest about it, nor was it a mistake. It was planned for months, by TKG in particular, when the 11 Ritviks were appointed and the Ritvik process was rejuvenated in the second week of July 1977. TKG, who was one of those new Ritviks, saw how he could parlay that into an appointment of Diksha Gurus when Prabhupada left the scene. That is exactly what he manipulated into effect in Mayapur 4 months later. TKG's scheme was buttressed by Swami B.R. Sridhar of Gaudiya Math. He asked Prabhupada's leaders, what was the basis of these 11's claim to being initiating spiritual masters? He received the reply that they had all been appointed as Ritviks 4 months earlier. To this, the Navadvip Mahant then stated, quote, Ritvik Acharya, then it becomes as good as Acharya, unquote. This green light, along with the Bengali Swami's Mat Guru Si Jagat Guru warned slogan, allowed the GBC to implement the zonal escapade, allowed the GBC to implement it, which was also mentioned by Swami V.R. Sridhar as the best method for the new gurus of so-called ISKCON to manage their movement, the zonal scam. It is ridiculous to attempt to wrap all of these deliberate events and incitements together and then blow them all off, and what went down as a result, which was horrendous, blow them all off as merely an unintentional, honest mistake. It was anything but a mistake. It was an institutional, intentional, planned and executed deviation that the 11 were able to pull off only for a short time. In doing so, they contaminated the movement in a big way until their scheme was replaced by another transformation. The first transformation was rooted in blatant disregard of Prabhupada's order because none of the 11 acted as a regular guru, and none of them were specifically appointed or specifically ordered by Prabhupada to be Diksha Guru. They weren't ordered to be Diksha Guru. He mentioned regular guru generically. There was no specific order. There was no specific appointment of names following the generic mention of regular guru. And a regular guru is not an Uttama. Now we'll go to that second rationalization. As far as the Uttama scam still being bona fide because the GBC authorized it, this is actually based on sub-rationalizations, other ones. One of these is that the GBC has an automatic self-corrective mechanism embedded in it. This idea has no basis for verification. Prabhupada never said or wrote such a thing anywhere. There's no verification, there's no proof of this idea. Besides that, an automatic self-corrective mechanism can never be possessed by a group of conditioned souls. The other rationalization is that the GBC and what it mandates is automatically bona fide because it is empowered to be bona fide. It was never guaranteed any such status. What went down in the spring of 1978 proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was never guaranteed to have such a status, because via the Pretender Mahabhagavat imposition, which the GBC rubber stamped, it was countermandering Prabhupada's orders. In point of fact, at that time, it legislated and then had implemented by 11 of its most powerful members the exact opposite of what could be considered an example of a bona fide empowerment. Our allegiance is to Prabhupada and the Guru Parampara. It is never transitive to a deviant governing body. All of its rationalizations are an insult to intelligence. Those pretenders did not transmit bona fide bhakti initiations. Instead, they invultuated their victims with bogus bijas. In order to keep the scam going, they came up with explanations to satisfy those who were curious a bit, but insincere. This is mostly because Professor Blueblood in his second transformation of position papers allowed many of the great pretenders to keep their disciples as allegedly initiated by them. Those great pretenders who were allowed to keep disciples, they remained loyal to the GBC. And since they did not engage in grossly scandalous behavior, they were afforded the opportunity to get busted down to the status of Madhyam Adhikari, allegedly. Their disciples were allowed to remain recognized by the air quotes ISKCON institution as still having been genuinely initiated during the Uttama phase of the first transformation. The bad logic in this compromise is obvious. It's blatant. It is an insult to the intelligence of anyone who hears it. What to speak of those who accept it? and thus proving that they have no spiritual intelligence. As I mentioned, the rationalizations were many. One of the excuses was that after a gross fall down, the remaining first echelon in the GBC would allow the disgraced guru, previously having his initiation privileges removed by the institution, to cop a plea that he was spiritually sick but would get well soon. Another rationalization was that all of those 11 imitators were actually advanced devotees on the spontaneous platform, Raga Bhaktas. Oh yeah. However, because they accepted so many disciples and took so much sanchita karma in the process, they fell down to the kanishta platform and eventually to mundane sinful activity. Please note, please realize that those men never approached Raganuga at any time. They were light years away from it. They were all Sahajiyas right from the gate when they took over in their assigned zones and accepted Mahabhagavat worship from anyone and everyone in their zones, including God brothers and God sisters. Also, please note that none of them took the sanchita karma of anyone who they initiated with perverted bijas. They had no such authority. They had no such power to take sanchita karma. Instead, they took away from their new people, the ones they initiated, both good and bad prarabdha karma. When it was good karma, and they took a lot of that, the godmen stole it from their new disciples in order to enjoy the good life that was supposed to be afforded to them because they were the sum total of the demigods. Allegedly. Oh yeah, another rationalization, utilized mostly during the period between the new disciples' guru falling down and thus being spiritually sick, and a newcomer's reinitiation later during the second transformation, was that all those newcomers, all those new disciples, those unfortunates, they appeared to be in some kind of limbo concerning their status in that interim period. They wanted the movement and all their quote-unquote God brothers to still see them as being initiated. But how could they still be initiated before they accepted reinitiation, which was pushed hard at the beginning of the second transformation? That was explained in a way. The rationalization was that they remained initiated by ISKCON. They were initiated by ISKCON, by the corporation, by the institution. In some of the rest of the centers, and of course that was certainly not the case in Moundsville, while their guru was in good standing with the institution, when there was that fire sacrifice, that ceremony of initiation, those newcomers got the ISKCON bij at that time. They got two bogus bijas. They got the guru's personal and peculiar bij, and they got the ISKCON bij. They didn't get the Bhakti Lata bij. And those who got the ISKCON bij, again, none of them in Moundsville got it, but those who got it, they weren't aware of it, but they still got it at the time of that bogus ceremony. To remain viable in the so-called ISKCON institution always meant and always means staying in good standing with the vitiated GBC. Although the governing body did not come up with all of the rationalizations I've just enunciated connected to the first two transformations, there's no record of it having disapproved of any of those. Now, other rationalizations used by so-called ISKCON varied from zone to zone. For example, the aforementioned "you are initiated by ISKCON" placebo was utilized in the mid-80s by ISKCON of the Bay Area. There in the late 70s and early 80s, how could you not doubt your initiation after all that went down? We have only mentioned some rationalizations. The Pandora's box of the whole kit and caboodle was busted wide open when the heady zonal acharya epoch was implemented. This contamination was not limited to so-called ISKCON and its gurus, as we have demonstrated. The GBC is responsible for opening the Pandora's box, and its fingerprints are all over what kind of excuses were employed over the years in order to keep the loonies on the path. The effort was not at all that successful, proven when some of the unfortunates transferred their allegiances to Ritwik later on. Each rationalization, in combination with outright lies, subterfuge, and bad logic, comprises but another brick in the magic wonder wall of so-called ISKCON. You cannot see or get to the other side of that wall without breaking through it. However, first you have to recognize that it's an occult entity. What works to impede breakthrough is the many mirrors laid in that wonder wall, which are wrongly considered to be windows. These mirrors are analogous to pseudo-spiritual experiences that the magic of that cult produces in the tethered minds of their dedicated followers. So-called ISKCON, Neomut, and Ritwik have changed the system, have changed the process, have changed the style and mood, and arguably worst of all, have engaged in historical revisionism in order to change what actually went down and why it did so. These changes still kept perverted reflections of the process in place. Otherwise, if they didn't have the perverted reflections, all of the groups would be seen for what they were and what they are, and thus would be rejected immediately by virtually everyone. When you engage in dedication and service to a bogus guru, especially while under the gaslight that you have been genuinely initiated by him, you will undergo various occult experiences on the astral plane which work to convince you that you're rightly situated. The universe reciprocates like that, and those mirrors in the wonder walls serve that function. However, if you would like to escape it all, simply step back and observe how nothing remains like it was when Prabhupada was steering the ship. Things have radically changed. Although the shock of the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats and their hijacking the movement in the late 70s is an exception, the other changes after that are not so easily noticed, and they were not so easily noticed while you were in them. In other words, those deviations were a bit gradual. The rationalizations kept and keep them apparently viable. You finally boil in overheated water like Mr. Frog, who was unable to notice the temperature changes in his water pan until it was too late.
I feel just a little bit older, now it fills my brain. I can flash through future years, and nothing is the same. Nothing is the same. Nothing is the same. Nothing is the same.
The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. A splinter group itself, along with those which later spun out from it, the whole magic show is nothing but a con. It's a con, and it's gone. It is being exposed over time, and people are catching on. Be intelligent enough to walk back the cat. Consult genuine sources for accurate history. Engage your higher intelligence and break through all of the rationalizations that keep you from recognizing just what the air quotes ISKCON Wonderwall is and what it is not. Such an accomplishment may be painful. However, if the common aphorism of no pain, no gain ever had a genuine application, it is applicable in this case. Finally, realize, without any compromise or rationalization whatsoever, that a bogus guru cannot transmit a bona fide initiation to anyone at any time, anywhere. Sadeva Samya.